The movement has also led to sparking some very important discussions. In one of these discussions, we have come across the idea of the acceptable versions of people of color. The premise of this idea is that having physical features closer to white people is deemed more desirable by the media. Many celebrities like Zendaya have pointed out this form of colorism and why it needs to change. Today, we have with us an expert on this subject, Dr. Jasmine Mitchell. Dr. Mitchell specializes in race and gender representation in popular culture. Her latest book, Imagining the Mulatta: Blackness in US and Brazilian Media, discusses this form of colorism by utilizing extensive case studies and analyzing policy debates. Dr. Mitchell holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota and a BA in American Studies from Williams College. Born in Philadelphia and raised in Brooklyn, Dr. Mitchell currently lives in Manhattan. She's an associate professor of American Studies and Media Studies at the State University of New York, Old Westbury. Following Dr. Mitchell's talk, we will open to discussion. Maya Gunasehra, Manager for Diversity Initiatives and Community Building, and Ian Reed, Associate Professor of Latin American Studies, will help moderate discussions. We especially encourage students to ask questions and comment. Please ask your questions in the chat box or press the raise your hand button on Zoom. In case you have a clarification, please wait until the end of the event to clear those. On behalf of Rare Center and the students of Soka University of America, welcome, Dr. Jasmine Mitchell. We hope to have a meaningful session with you this afternoon, and we look forward to learning more about you and this topic from you. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. And thank you so much for the invitation and for everyone that's here. I know that there's a lot of Zoom fatigue these days. I appreciate everyone's presence and energy, and I hope to learn just as much from you. And I look forward to the Q&A. So first, I really want to think about how do we make justice part of what we do every day? Okay, so that might be the conversations that we have at home, to what we watch on Netflix, to the language that we use. And how do we build up values? How do we build up languages to dismantle oppressions? And instead of thinking about racial progress, right? We often think about racial progress or gender progress. I really want us to think more about transformation, right? How do we transform the way that we think, or the way that we know, or the way that we see, right? Race, gender, sexuality, and nation. We're part of that project just by being here today. So first, I wanted to start talking about how I came to this book, right? Imagining the Mulatta: Blackness in US and Brazilian Media. And I always think it's important for writers and researchers to talk about what's their stance, hey, what's really their skin in the game. And that came really from personal experiences, right? And like many women who did not fit into the imagined US racial landscape of Black, white, binaries, right? You're either one or the other. I was continuously asked when I was growing up, and I see my own children are asked this all the time, where are you from? No. Hey, where are your parents from? Or if they felt frustrated by that, what are you? Okay. And when I travel outside the US, I often receive actually the same types of questions, because the US exported media images, right, largely erases not just my visibility, right, but anyone who does not appear, right, as the quintessential white, blonde-haired, blue-eyed image of a white American. And at the same time, there's what I started to see in the 1990s and 2000s was this fascination of mixed race as this advent of a new special group. We even heard some of the same kind of rhetoric with Kamala Harris, right, recently, right, as they're somehow special or exceptional. And what I find really confusing about that is it's not just my family, but so many families have had a long history of racial mixing within the United States for hundreds of years. And so it would often really frustrate with people when I would say, oh, oh, I'm from the United States. No, where are your parents from? We're from the United States. We've been part of the United States actually before America even existed. And so I really question, right, this emphasis on newness or on uniqueness, right? For what political purpose does this focus on a new people serve? So my mother's side of the family, right, is African American, and that runs the gamut from light skin to dark skin, and an acknowledgement of racial mixing within our family tree. And I am still, right, but I have become increasingly concerned about how African American diversity is often silenced from this conversation. I'm also often perplexed at this conservative proclamation that there's no longer a need for race-based policies, such as affirmative action, protection of rights, such as voting rights, because we've made so much racial progress, and isn't everyone going to be mixed anyway someday? As for Brazil, my travel and work experiences there also profoundly shaped my research. I first traveled to Brazil in 2000, and I, like many African Americans before me, had bought into Brazil's this myth for people of color. Right? I was ready to go to Brazil. I thought it was going to be some paradise. Everyone was going to look like me. I was going to fit right in. There was going to be no more racism. I wasn't going to have to deal with any of that stuff that I have to deal with in the US. And boy, was I wrong. I was very, very, very wrong. Because Brazil has long promoted itself as a racial democracy in which extensive racial mixing and the lack of legal segregation in comparison to the US made it special, made it unique. Right? And so racial democracy relies on this idea that because there's no rigid racial lines that delineate Black from white, racism simply doesn't exist. So my first job after college was actually at the American School in Sao Paulo. And most of my students were actually Brazilian. And on the very first day, they, along with some of the other teachers, thought I was part of the cleaning staff. In the building that I lived in, I was a building with mostly white residents. I was accused of stealing laptops, yoga mats, basically anything that went missing in that building. Right? I was often accused of stealing. I was also told on multiple occasions that I needed to use the service elevator when visiting colleagues or friends in their buildings. So there was this presumption that anyone who looked like me did not belong. And so I really grappled with this contradiction of this idea of racial democracy, when yet most media images were white, most government and business sectors were white, most university spaces, including the University of Sao Paulo, where I did a lot of this research on media, were mostly white. So how is it that we saw these images, right, of mixed race women, especially mixed Black women, right, that are celebrated during Carnival and Samba, that were marketed internationally as proof that racism doesn't exist, right? Proof that Brazil has a racial democracy. And yet, people of African descent were so marginalized and excluded from power. And so my understanding then of mixed race and Blackness has evolved over the course of my life, and I now identify as a mixed Black woman. Hey, so those aren't contradictions, but they actually go together. Okay? And so the inspiration for this book has been actually this personal landscape of negotiating race, gender, sexuality, and nation, and hopes for further solidarity between the United States and Brazil, as well as other parts of the globe in struggles for social justice. So I'm just gonna walk us through just a couple of images here and do the PowerPoint, right, just to kind of, to be honest, organize myself sometimes. But I'm really looking forward to the questions from you at the end. Okay. So I also always like to, put out here, if you ever want to email me, I actually love getting questions from people not affiliated with my university. So my email is just right here, mitchellja@oldwestbury.edu. Don't spam me, please, but please do reach out if you would like to get in touch. And so I really want to talk about what my central research questions are in this work. It's really the big questions were, hey, how does the mixed Black female figure really embody this contradiction of racial inequality at the same time as she represents racial harmony? And how does the mulatta, right? So the mulatta is this woman of African and European descent. And she's become this symbol, this weighted symbol and figure in both the US and Brazil, and I would argue actually throughout the hemisphere. How does she actually mask anti-Blackness in the Americas? And then third, how does popular media, right, of what we might, and we'll go through some of this media, right, of anything from Fast Five to hip hop videos, actually reinforce these ideologies of white supremacy, right, even when they're supposedly progressive. Right? So the main crux, right, of this book is that both Brazil and the US, right, utilize the symbol and imagery of mixed Black female bodies as a vehicle to uphold white supremacy and to manage or discipline people of African descent. And for women, this is often disciplining, right, through sexuality, through labor, and through mothering, or the idea of mothering. Okay, so first, I often get, why the US and Brazil, right? How did you come up with those two countries? And really, how could I not? Hey, so what I would really say, in order to understand the US, hey, and US racism, you actually have to go to Brazil. You have a better vision, hey, a better insight to what's happening in the US if you look outside. And the same with Brazil. Right? And thinking about their connections together, right? The hemispheric connections that they have, the commonalities, right? So both have histories of slavery and emancipation. I mean, and actually the history of Brazilian slavery, it actually far outscales, right, that of the US, but often in the US, we don't think of it that way, right? Both have large populations of African descent, right? With Brazil actually having the second largest population, right, of African descent outside of Nigeria. Right? Large media industries, right? Brazilian media industry, especially the TV industry, right, is one of the top 5 biggest in the world. We often don't know that in the US, right? And in both countries, right, mixed Black female figures, right, are these key symbols in national identity. Now, what are some of the big differences, right? They're not one and the same. And so again, the big difference, right, is that Brazil has historically not had legal segregation, and has upheld this myth of racial democracy, that because there's been so much racial mixing, there's no longer any kind of racism and everyone's equal. Okay? And finally, that in the US, race is often based on ancestry, right? So who are your parents and grandparents, right? That one drop of Black blood way back in your family history will make you Black, versus race in Brazil is based on what you look like, right? Your phenotype, your skin color, your hair. And as I'll argue later in this book, it's not quite, it's a little simplistic, but I also think about how your sexuality, right, is also presented. So again, right, just to recap, right, the race in Brazil, right, has these official census categories that we might think of: branca, white; parda, brown; preta, Black; amarela, yellow, right, which is often refers actually to the populations of Asian descent, indigena, indigenous. But the way in which people actually talk to each other, right, is not these official census categories, right? It's these ones that are actually much more vague, right, such as morena, which can mean anything from brunette, right, that's white, to actually just a polite way to call someone Black, because Blackness in Brazil has such a stigma, as it's often associated with ugliness, with poverty, with being uneducated. Right? To a term like mulatta, which really means mixture, but when it's referred to as woman, is often really highly sexualized. To negra, which is often associated with race consciousness and pride. Okay, so it's on to the crux of this book now that we've kind of got some of that context out. So this photo here, Kate, is from National Geographic magazine, Kate, and from the 2016 cover. And National Geographic, like other magazines such as Time, Newsweek, right, has a history often of placing women of racial ambiguity on the cover in a fetishized, exotic way, right, that often describes them as striking, remarkable, and predicting a new racial utopia. Okay. So, for example, a 1993 cover Time magazine envisioned the new face of America, which was a computer-generated image of a slightly tanned woman embodying the US racial feature. Okay. 20 years later, in 2013, National Geographic said, we're becoming a country where race is no longer so black and white. So there's this idea of the multiracial, right? The mixed black or mixed, we're not quite sure what she is, as a global political ideal. And what this does, it erases our histories of racial violence. It erases, right, in which mixing has been happening in a long time. And it's an imagined feature in which Blackness itself becomes part of the past. Right? It actually becomes a barrier to achieving these visions of racial utopia. Okay, so this was, sorry, I should have gone there, right? This was the kind of image from 1993, right, from Time magazine. So this is kind of like a long-standing thing, right? It's not something new, right? There's actually been a US obsession with constantly fetishizing and imagining a better future, right, through racial mixing, but one in which Blackness is not really part of the picture. Okay. So in other words, right, she's often really a celebratory figure. Okay. So again, there's just this kind of and it's especially often through women, right? And we'll talk soon about why, right? Why is it women often that are the projected ideal and not men? So again, some of the ways historically in which mixed Black women have been presented is often as hypersexual, sexually promiscuous, as desirable, as manipulative, untrustworthy. Right? And this goes all the way from the very first, right, feature-length film, Birth of a Nation, to Carmen Jones, to what I would argue we still have today, right? Of one in which mixed Black women are seen primarily through their sexuality. And there's a lot of similarities with the Brazilian mulatta figure, who is often propped up during Carnival, right, as being sexually available, as being sensual, not beautiful, right? And as being sexually available to all. Okay. And in Brazil, right, she's often really actually evidence of Brazil's racial mixing. So in both countries, I would argue, but especially in Brazil, right, the mulatta has and continues to act as a symbol of national identity. In Brazil, she's celebrated as a sexual object. Right? Yet the discourse of Brazilian racial democracy, based on extensive racial mixing, started to shift, especially in the 1990s. Okay, so I also just want to give that context here. Okay. So what we see in the 1990s in Brazil is that there's increased Afro-Brazilian social and political mobilization, the introduction of affirmative action and racial quotas, and the gradual opening up of spaces for Afro-Brazilian actresses on mainstream television. Okay. At the same time, okay, that there's a discussion of possible racial inequities. There's a whole questioning of who are we, right? What is Brazilian national identity if we acknowledge racism? Okay. So at the same time, right, that there's been this discourse of racial democracy and racial mixing, there's also this discourse and practice of whitening, right, or push towards what we call branqueamento. So one of the questions I also have is how do mixed women's bodies also get used as reproductive labor to whiten the population? So this painting here that I'm showing you is a painting that the translation would be Ham's Redemption. And it's from 1895. And it really, I think, illustrates Brazil's whitening ideology. So after, so Brazil was the last country in the hemisphere to abolish slavery in 1888. And what Brazil did is it actually started to subsidize European immigration, okay, to whiten the nation, right? So there's this idea that Brazil would never be modern because of its Black population. And so what we see here, right, is on our left, we see our Black grandmother, presumably formerly enslaved, her daughter in the middle, right, her son-in-law all the way on the right, and then her grandson. And she's praising God, right, for erasing the stain of Blackness on her family line. Right? So really, right, at the same time, there's this celebration of racial mixing. Really what it's about is making the country less Black, right? Moving the country, right, towards being a gradually whiter nation. So what I'm really interested in here, right, is how through looking at Brazil and the US together, right, and taking up gender and sexuality along with race, right, how can we think about how race is actually regulated with mass media as actually an instrument of managing Blackness? And how does the mixed Black female body, right, actually become a project of disciplining and managing Blackness? And so let's look at pop culture. So this image here is from Jennifer Beals in Flashdance, right, from the early 80s in 1983. And part of what I'm interested in this book is how do these historical legacies of colonialism, of slavery, right, how do they actually seep in and haunt our present, right, of the way that we think about and talk about race? How does that come to bear, right, in the 2000s? So the first chapter of my book, right, really kind of gives this historical layout and context. And chapter 2, right, looks at celebrities, right? So it looks at mixed Black celebrities like Jennifer Beals, who really gained fame in the early 1980s. And what I would say is that the specter, right, of the hypersexual or sexually available mulatta, right, is echoed throughout, right, popular culture, right, even till today. And what this chapter also does is it tries to lay out with celebrities some of the major debates, right, that each country is having. So Beals here, right, is subverting this Black-white binary and the way in which the media talks about her, right? It frames her mixedness first as kind of liminal, right, as exceptional, right? And eventually, it's not until the 2000s that she's actually able to fashion, right, this biracial identity. By the 2000s, she's actually able to actually request scripts, right, that feature explicitly biracial characters. But in the beginning, right, the way she's often characterized as mysterious, right, as exceptional, right, very much in line with the way in which mixed Black women are imagined, right, as being somehow exceptional, as being sexually available, and as being really part of this haunting of the nation. If we look at someone like a Halle Berry, right, as well, Halle Berry is interesting, right, in that she identifies as Black. She acknowledges her white mother, but what I would say is the mainstream press, right, and media are obsessed with talking about her racial mixture constantly. And it's often framed, right, as something that's actually wrong with her, right, or part of why she has so many tragedies in her life, part of why this is why Halle can't keep a man, right, but yet is so sexually desirable to all, right? That this, is part of, right, really who she is, right, in which her mixedness, right, actually is part of her downfall, but also part of her allure. And she acknowledges, again, this racial mixture within Blackness and rejects this idea of a post-racial US. She aligns herself with Black identity, but nonetheless, what we see within the mainstream press and also the roles that she plays is that she's nonetheless subject to these mulatto tropes, right, as sexually available, as tragic, and as mentally unstable, and this idea, Haley's crazy, right? That's why the men always leave her. There's something wrong with her, right? Rather than actually thinking about misogyny right? And sexism and racial oppression, right? The blame becomes put upon her. And finally, I also look at Camila Pitanga in Brazil, who I'm kind of obsessed with. She's fascinating to me. Right. So Camila Pitanga in Brazil is actually not, by traditional Brazilian standards, is often not thought of as Black. Right. And she herself talks a lot about this in the Brazilian media, that when she asserts a Black identity, right, that's how she identifies. She's been told that, why do you identify as Black? You're Morena, you're not Black. You're too pretty to be Black. Why would you do that? And she'll respond, this is exactly why I identify as Black, okay? And that she identifies as Black, right? Not just because of her familial line, but as a political identity. Nonetheless, the way in which, despite how she identifies publicly, right, what else is it within magazines and newspapers, and also the roles that she plays, that her persona often feeds in to these ideas of Brazilian racial democracy, such as we see in this cover, right, which literally means, right, the synthesis of Brazil, right, that she is an icon of Brazilian national identity within this idea of Brazilian racial mixture. Okay. And I'm happy to take more questions, but I just want to kind of go through, right? There's so much that we can talk about. So first, I just want to give it just an intro for, I'm not sure how many of you are familiar with telenovelas. So Brazilian telenovelas they're often saying, isn't that like a soap opera? Yes and no, right? So Brazilian telenovelas, right, are really serial melodramas. And they run pretty much Monday through Saturday. And we have nothing like that here in the US, okay? Where at any given time, the majority of the population is watching the same TV program at the exact same time, okay? And in Brazil, it's considered actually quite prestigious to be in a telenovela. Okay, so some of the most talented writers, actors want to be, right, in these telenovelas. And this is also really important. It's not just US ideas of race that get exported. Okay, since Brazil actually sells its telenovelas to the rest of the world, and they're exported to over 130 countries, right? Ideas about race are being exported all over the world through a Brazilian framework. Okay, which is why I think it's so important, right, to not just focus on the US, not just focus on Brazil, but actually to think about these conversations about global anti-Blackness. Okay, so that's a little on telenovelas. Okay, here I'm just gonna go through. Now, telenovelas are also pretty much dominated by one company, TV Global. Okay, so it has about 70%, right, of the national content production, right? Pretty much a monopoly, which we can go into in the Q&A, why it stems from the Brazilian military dictatorship. And it has about 54% of TV audiences at any given time. Right? So telenovelas and TV Global are kind of synonymous with each other. And that's why most of the telenovelas I look at are also TV Global. At the same time, as we've talked about, right, Afro-Brazilians are supposedly celebrated for samba, for carnival, increasingly for capoeira, but yet you go to a newsstand and you turn on the TV channel, where are they? Right? Except maybe as a chauffeur, right, as the domestic. And so there's largely a media stigmatization of Afro-Brazilians, right? They don't exist, right, for the most part. And if telenovelas, right, are widely watched, and I'm talking about, this can be anyone from like your 90-year-old grandmother, right, in Rio de Janeiro, to your 40-year-old, right, cowboy, right, that's in the Brazilian Mato Grosso, right? There's this kind of national audience for telenovelas in which there's major discussions of who we are as a nation is reflected in Brazilian telenovelas, and Afro-Brazilians aren't there. What does that say about the nation? Or largely marginalized. So I said, right, in the 90s and 2000s, there becomes a widening debate, right? About is there racism in Brazil? And maybe we should do something about that. And that coincides, right, at the same time with a gradual opening of Afro-Brazilian actresses, right, in kind of mainstream roles. Yet it's within limits. So Camila Pitanga, who we just talked about, right, who identifies publicly as Black, she still plays largely in most of the telenovelas that she's in into these tropes of mixed Black women. So what I would say in a telenovela like Bellissima, which is in 2007, she plays this, slim, beautiful maid who is a virgin. This is very important, right? Who is humble, she's graceful, and the men, white men, love her, are obsessed with her, right? And she has a Cinderella story, right? Her beauty and her natural goodness and capacity, right, to be a good mother, right, are what captivate, right, the white wealthy men around her. And what I would say here is that her straightened hair, her lighter skin, her virginity, right, allow her to climb social class, allow her to be seen as potentially an upper class lady, right? So she can go from, there's some similarities, right? People I've got in past audiences, they're like, is this like J-Lo Made in Manhattan? I'm like, yeah, kind of similar, right? This is why it's hemispheric, right? These ideas that you can transcend race if you align with white patriarchy, right? Especially, right, in terms of eventually bearing children, right? Children that will help whiten the nation, right? That we rarely, right, see telenovelas that have Afro-Brazilian women in them in which they're actually paired with Afro-Brazilian men, right? Because this would ruin the love story, right, in which the mulata who represents Brazilian racial democracy, right, and all that's celebratory, it erases those histories of colonial violence, right? It erases these histories of slavery in which women of African descent did not actually get to consent, right? And it makes it a love story that still continues into the 2000s, right, in which Brazil will eventually become a whiter nation, and it can be celebrated for its racial mixing, i.e., eradicate the Black population through the sexual and reproductive labor of women. Now, what I would say, right, is that that's kind of this Morena, right, type archetype that Camila Pitanga plays, and that's one way in which mixed Black women are sometimes presented. The other one is explicit as mulata, in which they're hypersexual. And this one, in which she's in Paraíso Tropical, she literally plays a sex worker, right? And while it's never explicit, right, that she's Afro-Brazilian, she has a different soundtrack. It's the only one with a samba soundtrack, right? The food that she eats is constantly referenced, right? And they're associated with Afro-Brazilian foods, right? And she's presented as a sort of this pretty woman type character, right? That she wants to ascend into the upper classes, but she's going to do it through sex. She's going to do it through manipulation, and she's not seen as inherently good. She cannot be the mother of a future whiter nation. She's solely there for sexual pleasure. Right? So this is another way, right, in which Blackness gets regulated. Right? It's either through whitening the nation, through reproductive labor, or through sexual availability and sexual pleasure. But in Paraíso Tropical, right, she's never actually going to reproduce. So the storyline here, right, she actually does ascend or attempt to ascend. She has a white lover. She becomes pregnant, and she eventually goes to she gets arrested. She miscarries during the arrest, and part of that punishment for her even trying to ascend into the upper classes is this banning from motherhood. Now in telenovelas, motherhood is similar to the US, like the pinnacle of femininity. So basically what the telenovela is doing is it's relegating her solely to the world, right, of sexual pleasure for white men. Right? Now, I would also say there's a lot of actually similarities with the US, right, in this way. Um, so here I'm looking at Monsters Ball from 2001, which was widely acclaimed. Halle Berry, right, was the first African-American woman to win Best Actress. And really what much of the Hollywood critics praised her role was really about the graphic sex scenes in it, right? In which she was seen as raw, right, realistic. So what we see is that there's also a constant fetishization, right, of sexuality. So in Monsters Ball, what we have here is, again, there's a kind of exorcism of Blackness. So Halle Berry's role, she plays Letitia. She's a Black mother whose husband is literally executed by the state, right, when he's imprisoned. Her Black son dies. Right, and instead of asking these questions about structural racism, right, or why is she impoverished, why is she in this predicament, dun, 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 we have our kind of white male savior, right, who, in a way, right, is racist, comes from an explicitly racist family. And instead of actually learning more about Letitia, really what I would argue, the film is actually about Hank as a white savior who is able, we know nothing about Letitia. It's like, you have no other family, you have no friends, nothing. You're just kind of there. And what that does is it allows her to be completely cut off from Blackness and puts her into white civil society, literally represented by a white executioner. Right? And because her sexuality is highlighted constantly, right, it places her hypersexuality as being disciplined by Hank, right? By really what we're talking about is the white male savior that will eventually possibly give her the potential of integrating into civil society, again, at the cost of cutting off all ties to Blackness and literally the deaths of her Black family members, is what enables audiences to see her as potentially being one of us. Right? And these aren't supposedly kind of progressive films. And I would say similarly in The L Word, which was a really groundbreaking TV series from the early 2000s. It was the first TV series that centered on lesbians and bisexual and trans women. And despite this, supposedly progressive nature, same thing, right? So in a post-civil rights context, there's this overlapping nature of, isn't it so great that we're multicultural? Isn't it so great that we've made so much progress? Yet we don't want that abject Blackness. Right? We don't really want Blackness here, right? Because then we'd actually have to really think about systemic racism, really grapple with our histories. So in this chapter, in this part, I look at Jennifer Beals. You might have remembered from Flashdance. And in this role, she explicitly plays a mixed Black character, right? She asked specifically for the writers, right, to write her characters mixed and Black, because she wanted to give more visibility, right, to mixed families. And she's successful, she's highly educated, she's the director of an art museum. It's supposedly progressive, yet at the same time, she's hypersexual, right? She can't keep her pants on. She's untrustworthy. She is accused constantly of playing the race card, of trying to use race as a gain. And her partner, Tina, who's white, is projected often as angelic. She's the mother of, they have a child together. She's the mother, right? Tina is actually the victim, right? Versus, right, the overly aggressive hypersexual Bet. Okay. So again, right, what I really want us to pay attention to, right, is even in cultural productions, TV shows and films that seem progressive, how do we actually see these regressive ways of talking about race, gender, and sexuality? And how am I doing on time here? Ooh, okay. I'm gonna show some images here, and then we'll get to the question part. So finally, I was really interested in how does the US imagine Brazil? Right? So how do these ideas of race travel? So I was really interested in looking at hip hop videos and ideas of Brazilian women. So I'm just going to show you a little clip here.
Oi, fala comigo.
Yo, let me talk to Snoop.
No telefone.
Yeah. Yo, dog, we on the way to do the video. For sure.
So what we see in these hip hop videos, and I'll show you just one more, right, is that Brazil is imagined not just as a racial paradise, but as a racial and sexual paradise. Right? And this is interesting here, right? Especially for African American men, right? So within the African American imagination, Brazil has often been projected as this site of potential racial freedom because Brazil has not historically had legal segregation. But importantly, right here, that for African American men in the 2000s, it also gets represented as this place of sexual freedom, right? Unburdened from this historical weight, right, of colonial violence within the US. And it gets reimagined as this place of just, well, beaches and sexually available women.
Ladies, here we go. Baby, where'd you get your body from? Tell me where'd you get your body from? Baby, where'd you get your body from? Tell me where'd you get your body from?
I got it from my.
Okay. I can show you more and then it would always be fun. But really what I want to focus on the use of these videos for is how does, like Brazil itself, how does the Brazilian mulatta figure become reconfigured in the US imagination of Brazil as a site of racialized sexual pleasure and freedom that mediates really between the exotic and familiar, right? So she seems, oh, so familiar to what we actually have in the US, but unburdened, right? But what we think about, right, with these historical legacies of Jim Crow, because again, remember, Brazil markets itself as this place of complete freedom, right? So it becomes a destination, right, for African American men, right, to be empowered and to feel free. But again, it's through actually the unfreedom, right, of Brazilian women of African descent. Okay. Right. And even in films, right, like Fast Five, right, which in part the Fast and the Furious series, right, is renowned for having this racially diverse cast. Vin Diesel, who AKA is racially ambiguous himself, mixed in black, right, but doesn't always openly articulate that. This also in this film, Brazil becomes this site of freedom, right, literal freedom, right, in this case. And what I would say in these users' productions, right, is that really Brazil acts as a mirror, right? That for some, it acts as this mirror of a potential US future, right, of what will look out like in the future, right? Of this place where we might have this racial utopia. And for others, right, it's a way to actually mediate these racial anxieties, as by as many of us know, by 2050, right, the US will no longer be a majority white nation. Just going to skip through these just for, I want to get to the question soon. And then finally, you know, I'm also really interested in how does Brazil imagine itself and present itself to the world? And what I would say is that Brazil, well, it's beginning to acknowledge, right, its place as a majority Black population, right? It also stages, especially through the World Cup and the Olympics, has relied on this discourse of multiracialism, right, as a global ideal, while actually denying its history of racisms, right? Denying the continuing racial violence, right? So that it can continue to project Okay, this ideal of Brazil as a model to the world. And what I'm interested in, okay, just to finish up, is that representation matters, right? So I'm thinking about popular media representation, or whether it be representation in politics, right? So here I'm thinking about when like Kamala Harris, right, here on the left, right, Marielle Franco, right, who was a Brazilian politician who was tragically assassinated, right? She was openly Black, queer, right, really trying to advocate for people who live in favelas, which are often low income, marginalized areas, for people of African descent, for women, for those who are queer. And what I'm hoping that we're starting to see now, especially in the 2020s, is actually a pivot towards embracing Blackness, right? A new vision of who can lead, of who can represent, right, in media, or who can represent us, right, politically. And this is really the fruit of generations of Black feminist organizing. At the same time, I want us to be aware, right, to have our eyes open, even in these hopeful moments, so that we don't get racism and sexism that are fueled by multicultural neoliberalism. We don't get really a post-racial 3.0 because our work isn't done. Okay? And so our media texts that we're looking at are more than symbolic. They really envision the world that we have, the world that we want to create. And in a time of a global movement, what is our role? Right? How can we not be the exception? How can we not talk about bridging the difference? How can we actually be part of the kindle and the flames that eradicate systemic racism, eradicate racial terrorism, eradicate patriarchy, capitalism, imperialism? Hey, and how can we here, I'm really interested in hearing from you, use our education? How do we use the knowledge that we have to dismantle oppressions? And how do we learn about and learn from each other in these connective sites of resistance and solidarity? Okay, I'm gonna end here because I can go on all day, but I'd really actually love to hear from all of you and any questions that you might have so we can have more dialogue.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, for an incredible, incredible presentation, just really resonating in so many ways. And I'm mindful that some students may have to leave at the top of the hour for class. And so I want to really give first priority to any students who would like to ask a question or even a comment in response to Dr. Mitchell's closing question. So for folks who would like to share by voice, you can raise your hand using the raise your hand function, or you can throw anything in the chat. If you'd like to be anonymous, you can share it with me and then I can read it out. But, oh, great, Ayo, I see you're raising your hand. So maybe we can hear from Ayo. Okay, Ayo, are you able to unmute? Okay, perfect.
So yeah, I have a, my main question was, how did you decide the title of the book, I guess, especially the part fearing and desiring of women. What I got a lot from the talk and also what I was gathering from reading summaries of the book beforehand was that it's more so a book about mulatto representation in the U.S. and Brazil. And while you discussed somewhat in relation to morenas in Brazil, I just feel for more fully Black women and darker skinned Black women in the U.S. there wasn't much representation.
Oh, sure. Okay. Wait. So I just want to make sure that I understand your question. So please correct me if I'm wrong. So are you asking more about why the focus of the book was more on ideas of the mulata and morena and not necessarily inclusive of darker skinned Black women? Okay, great. Great question. Okay. Well, what I was really interested in, well, first I actually see right, the mulata morena as Black women, right? So not as separate, right? Because they're often thought of, right, as kind of a different category. And what I think that actually does, right, is it actually separates and disconnects, right, the potential solidarity and think about what's actually the bigger part of resistance here, right? The bigger picture right, is we should be resisting, right, is white supremacy. At the same time, I was really interested in how women who are often lighter skinned, right, right, Black women who are often lighter skinned or of mixed descent are often really fetishized, right? So it's no accident, right, that the vast majority of media images that we see here in the US and in Brazil, when we do see Black women, they tend to be light skinned, right? They're often mixed. Why? Right? And so I was really interested in that question. Okay, so that's one, right, of why focus specifically on this one kind of image or symbol. And part of it, I think, also was that because there's this fetishization, right, often sexual fetishization, right, of mixed Black women and light-skinned Black women, I think that opens up, right, larger questions of how are actually all Black women, right? How is their sexuality often not seen as actually their own, but as belonging to others? Right? And what I think I might be seeing in the future, I'm hopeful about this, is more lighter skinned Black women, such as Camila Pitanga in Brazil, right, or Zendaya, right, here in the US, or Tessa Thompson, right, using the roles that they have and using their platform, right, to try to actually open up more spaces, right, for darker skinned Black women, and to actually really have these rich and important discussions about colorism, right, and about anti-Blackness. And really what I would say, the reason why we see more lighter skinned Black women in positions of power or in media is that they're often seen as sexually more desirable and seen also as more palatable, more acceptable, right, to the imagined, right, audience, right, that they'll be seen as better for ratings, more acceptable, right, perhaps better be able to integrate, right, into mainstream, AKA, right, white civil society, right, unlike, right, unfortunately, right, they're darker skinned, right, Black kid, right, which is why we see like in A Monster's Ball or in these other kinds of films, right, literally in order to have them enter white civil society, they kill off their Black family members, right? Or even in films like I Love You Man, right, from Rashida Jones. Let's take a comedy, right? In these kinds of films, like, so Rashida Jones, you're gonna walk down the aisle, it's set as a wedding, right? And you have no friends or family, it's just you. And what that does is that it enables lighter skinned Black women to be seen, right, as they're kind of Black, but not really, right? To be seen as more acceptable, right? More pleasing, less threatening, right? To, right, the perceptions of white viewers. I hope that answered part of your question, and I'm happy to talk more if I didn't, or if it didn't clarify.
Anything else to respond with, or are you okay?
Yeah, I guess I kind of clarified. Sorry. Yeah, I guess like my concern was that like I feel that like in talking more so about like mulatto women and just in talking as about them as like it kind of felt as if like they were the representation of Black women fully, and which is like often true in the media, but I feel like I think it's also important to note that like the problems with that, and to note like how that affects darker skinned Black women. Yeah.
No, thanks for bringing that up. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right on that. On especially if thinking about the lack of roles that darker skinned Black women have in media, but also roles in general, right? Of thinking about, right, who leaders might be, right, in corporations, even if we're thinking about university settings, right, right, who are often seen, right, as the more acceptable, right, or less threatening, right, Black women. And so I think these are really important, right, conversations to have. And so what I definitely don't want in this book is for it to be like the end point, right? That is the only women, right, that we should talk about, right, are mixed Black women. Absolutely not, right? But how can we use that as a jumping off point to actually talk about anti-Blackness and to actually talk about how mixed Black women are often seen as the sites, right, or actually often seen as not having any agency, right? So in these films and TV shows, right, often these women have very little agency of their own, right? They're really seen, right, as sites of sexual labor. And if they try to step outside their bounds, they're often punished, right? What does that actually say about how patriarchy and anti-Blackness works? And how can we use that to open up spaces, right, to have larger conversations, right? If this is happening with lighter skinned Black women, right, to have larger conversations, right, about kind of global anti-Blackness and about how patriarchy and capitalism, I would also say here, right, is also working within. And so it's definitely not supposed to be an end, right, game conversation, but really as using mixed Black women as the site of inquiry to begin these conversations, especially because mixed Black women are often used as proof, as evidence that there's no racism.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell, and thank you, Ayo. I believe Linda has a question.
Yeah, you talked about how like this book was supposed to be as like a site of inquiry, but don't you think that media already, I think that media sees mixed Black women as Black women. They just see them as the ideal Black women to use on camera. So don't you think if we're going to talk about representation, we're going to talk about the people who are actually not represented in the media instead of those who are already given the spotlight? Because I think that a lot of works are already about, okay, the few works that are about Black women that are seen, or the issues that I talked about, the anti-Blackness, the sexual exploitation in movies, dark-skinned Black women face so much more, face like a lot because they're never acknowledged in their experiences. So I think that, how do you think that this book reflected that?
Mm-hmm. Sure. No, thank you for these are great questions. So again, right, I don't want to know that this is the end game, right, of talking, right, about colorism and anti-Blackness, but precisely because, right, when talking about there's a actually, I wouldn't even say there's an overrepresentation, right, of mixed Black women. What we really actually have is really an overrepresentation, right, of actually really what we have is an overrepresentation of white men. Quite frankly, right, in film and TV, right, and so because, right, resisting the limited parameters, right, in which Black women are presented within mass media tend to be light-skinned, right, but also, right, and we're saying that this is, right, so often there's this idea of like, look how much progress has made. See, we have some Black actresses, but you're absolutely right. Like they tend to be very light-skinned. They tend to only be presented in roles in which they're sexually exploited, right, or presented as sexually promiscuous. Right? And so I'm like, wait, why are we celebrating that? Right? Let's talk about this. Right? That's not progress. Right? Or if it's not in these kinds of roles, right, in which they're seen as sexually promiscuous, right, that we see no other, right, they're pretty much divorced from Blackness, right? So why don't we see, right, in many of these films and TV shows, if they're going to be presented as mixed and Black, why don't we see their family members? Why don't we see their friends? Why are they not, right, within Black communities? And what I would say is because what these mass media productions want, and this is, I think, a reflection really of US Brazilian values, is either to see Black women as solely for sexual labor, or, right, that Blackness itself is undesirable. Right? That Blackness itself must be something that must be eventually diluted, right, eradicated out. And that's really more of the questions, right, that I'm hoping can open up in this book, right? So not to say at all, right, that there shouldn't be more studies, right, on darker skinned Black women, absolutely, right? It's just that the focus of this book, right, is on how do mixed Black female figures embody, right, these contradictions, right, of, yeah, we have racial harmony, there's no racism, and also these racial anxieties and gendered anxieties, right, of anti-Blackness and sexuality. Okay, so really it's more, how can we think about these as vehicles, right, and sites of inquiry, right? But not to say at all, right, that these are important conversations. I'd actually love to hear, right, perhaps maybe you'll write that book, right? Or one of you here, right, will, I hope, right, make your a film or write a book, right, that is more inclusive or center some of these other kinds of questions.
Thank you, Dr. Mitchell and Linda. And I believe we have a question from Anjali.
Hi, and actually I just wanted to say you pronounced my name perfectly and I was so surprised. But anyway, I am a mixed Brazilian, and I get a lot of these comments that I think you mentioned in the beginning of your talk, where I hear a lot of like, well, you're not Black, you're mixed, or you're not mixed, you're Black. You know, a lot of that categorization, which is really interesting, especially when you hear it from the outside, especially when you hear it from a white person who maybe doesn't have any connection to that. But beyond that, I have always reflected on that question when people ask me how I categorize myself. I often use the word mixed, especially in the United States, because although I might have a different identity in Brazil, when I come to the United States, it feels wrong to identify as Black because my experiences are so different from what darker skinned women experience. And I feel like being aware of those differences and those experiences is really important. Like we're taking on, it's hard to explain, so I guess my question is what your opinion is on that categorization. You know, you referred to a couple of women who call themselves Black, who might look more traditionally mixed, and I wanted to hear your opinion on that.
Sure. No, I think these are great questions. So thank you for this openness here. And what I would also say is that actually not talking about mixture within Black experiences is actually part of erasure, right? That's actually, right, especially within a US context, right, part of colonial erasure, right, in which, there's the Black race and there's the white race and they're completely separate, right? Because really what that was about protecting the very idea and notion of whiteness. Despite, we know that's not true, right? There's been racial mixing here, consensual and non-consensual, since the very beginnings of this country. Okay? So what I would actually say is that by also erasing the history of mixture, that's also actually erasing, right, part of Black experiences, right? So it's not the only experience, right? But it's part, right, of Black history. It's part of Black experiences, right? Even as many that we, at least here in the US, right, talk about as, key Black historical figures, right? Many, right, were mixed themselves, but identified as Black. And so I also think that there's not one way to look mixed, right? So loving the idea of like, look mixed. I'm like, well, what does that mean? Right? And what I would say is that often really relies on this idea as race is something that you can see, right? As race is something that you just know, right, off the body. And I think that can be also a way to collapse different categories, right? So I myself, right, kind of in the 2000s, there was a lot of questions, in the 1990s about should there be a change to the US Census and should we just have a multiracial category? And I'm really hesitant about those ideas because what that does as well is it collapses like anyone, you can be, mixed, Japanese and white, you could be mixed, Korean and Black, mixed, indigenous, right, and Indian American, and it makes all those experiences, right, and the particular historical particularities of those, it collapses them all together, right, and that actually helps feed, right, into not being able to see systemic and structural racisms. Right. So that's why I personally, right, prefer to, and everyone's, personal choice to identify as mixed, right? Because I acknowledge that my particular experience, right, might be different than others, but also Black, and to also identify as Black at the same time, because that is simply just part of, right, the histories of Blackness within the Americas. And I also see Black, thirdly, as a political identity. Okay, so it's not just what you look like, it's not just who your parents were, right? But how can we also take Black, right, as also a political identity, and to take that on? And so that's why I'm really interested in, particularly in actresses like Camilla Patanga, who in many ways actually should be not have an incentive, right, to identify as Black, right, could choose, right, what perhaps have a much easier career, right, but choose, right, to align themselves, right, in order to use their personhoods, right, as part of, right, dismantling racism, right, and as also part of having pride in being Black. So that was, sorry, a convoluted, right, idea, and it's different, right, in each country. But what I'm thinking that's happening within the Americas, right, so Brazil and the US, right, as more of a resurgence, right, of Black pride, and more of a resurgence, right, on what are the solidarities that we can have with each other, at the same time as, just like we having today, these really hard discussions about colorism within Black communities, because those are very important to have as well. Okay, and this is also another one that we often don't talk about, right? Really also need to have serious conversations, right, about misogyny within Black communities as well, right, about patriarchy and misogyny too. I hope that helped.
Thank you. Anjali, did you want to respond at all, or have a follow-up?
I actually have a class that I have to get to, but I appreciate your response. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that question.
Thank you. I believe we have a question from Nadani next.
Hi, I enjoyed your talk, and I have a sort of convoluted question, but I wonder, you started out sort of with this parallelism, or maybe even a paradox between the United States and Brazil, and looking at the way we classify race for people who are mixed. But by the end, I'm not so sure where you ended up. Mm-hmm. And so I wanted to know whether you felt like sort of on this trail that you're taking us, do you get the sense that we're in the same place? And I sort of have a follow-up question to that, which is particularly for the example of the hip hop example that you showed, I think it was Snoop Dogg and Pharrell and Beautiful. And you highlighted Brazil, but Pharrell and Snoop Dogg actually have another video, Let's Get It Blown, I think, or something like that. And that's actually, I believe, filmed in the US. But the women look exactly the same. And so I just wanted to kind of put those two questions out there and have you address that.
Sure. No, thank you so much for these questions and for this clarification. I realize I left out a major part, which sometimes happens when I get too excited. So why I also want to put Brazil and the US together is that Brazil and the US are often thought of as so different. And what I actually found in this research is they're actually not so different. They're really not. Right? Really, the commonalities here, right, are an upholding, right, of white supremacy. They just have different ways of managing Blackness, okay? Different ways of disciplining Blackness, okay? Different ways of talking about Blackness, but the end game's the same. Okay? The end game, okay, is really this fear and anxiety around Blackness. And the end game in both countries, hey, I do think that they're getting more and more similar, right? Actually, particularly in the way in which race is talked about. And the end game in both countries is often, right, the fear and anxiety about Blackness is actually rooted often in women's bodies, particularly mixed Black women's bodies, right? Of, are they going to have their Blackness infiltrate, right, or pollute, right, our white population? And if we do so, how are we going to manage that? Right. So let's contain it, right? That Blackness is merely thought of as for sexual pleasure, right? In which, why I think also mixed Black women are often, right, presented as very, very, very sexually available, right? Very desirable, right? But with no agency. or right, presented as potentially reproductive vessels that will help widen the nation. But the cost of that, right, is we're going to and cut off those ties to Blackness. Right? We're going to see them as kind of different, but not getting closer or getting less Black. Right? So what I would actually say is that both countries, right, have different ways of talking and different kinds of imagery, but the main ideology is actually the same. Right? And part of the problem, I think, is that the US often talks about itself as exceptional. And it's like, yeah, we had this racism problem, but look at us, right? You're like, we have Barack Obama, we have Harris, like, look how we're doing great, right? We should be a model for the rest of the world. And Brazil does the same thing, right? The rest of the world, you have this racism problem. You should come by to Brazil and study us. We've got this problem solved. Look, it's Carnival. Look at these beautiful mulatto women that we have that we only take out once a year to parade around, right? And export on TV shows dancing around half naked, right? Come and study us. Right? So I think that part of the disconnect has often been is that both the US and Brazil think of themselves as exceptional, right? When actually they're not, right? They're not at all, right? They're actually very, very similar to each other. So finally, I would also say the part of the African-American imagination of Brazil, and I should say African-American male imagination of Brazil, right? Because this is really important, right, to talk about here, is that you're absolutely right. The women in these US hip hop videos look almost exactly the same as the woman in these hip hop videos that are set in Brazil, right? So there's this fetishization, right, of women who are light-skinned who look like they are mulatta or actually mulatta, right? But what happens in Brazil, right, is because it doesn't seem to have this weight of, or this baggage, really, I would say, of Jim Crow segregation, right? It's seen as this tropical, racial, sexual paradise. It's no accident that a lot of these videos are set not just in Brazil, but in the Caribbean, right? Dominican Republic, right? Trinidad, right? That these are all sites, right, in which African-American men, right, can be free, not just from racism, but really from that baggage of US histories, right? So it becomes very attractive, right, then in the way in which other countries within the hemisphere, particularly in the Caribbean and Latin America, are imagined, and especially imagined as the ideal. Right? Did that clarify some? So I think you're right on, right, with there, in that there's a lot of similarities. They pretty much are one and the same. There's a fetishization, right, of women who are perceived to be mixed or light-skinned. But in Brazil, in other parts of the Caribbean and Latin America, imagine a place where it's a larger site of freedom. And I would say that also goes along with, it's not a new thing. I mean, there's a long history of African Americans and African American men imagining Brazil as the site of political freedom. And then I would say what we get in the 1990s and 2000s is that there's also imagining of Brazil as not just a site of political freedom, but also as a site of sexual freedom. So my question then is, how do we have these African American male producers not really become very similar to what we think of as, white male imperialists, right, or white European travelers, right, that are doing exactly the same thing, right, and giving women very little agency?
Thank you.
No, thank you.
Thank you. Oh, great. Maybe we have time. Ian, one more question. Is that okay? I see Kennedy has a question. So maybe we can, Kennedy, if you can unmute and ask your question. And this may be approaching the last question, but if time allows, we'll have one more. So please, Kennedy, can you unmute?
Hi, sorry, I didn't mean to, I know we don't have a lot of time left, but I just want to ask, a lot of the images that you use and speak of when you reference mixed women tend to kind of have this very specific look and idea of what a mixed woman is. But I just want to challenge that, because all mixed women are not light skinned or have this 3C, 3B hair. Like there are dark skinned mixed women too. And like the way that they're sexualized and viewed is completely different from like the idealization of what mixed women are. So how does that fit into your analysis? Like there's still a level of colorism that we need to be talking about, even amongst talking about just mixed women in general. And then that's not even adding to mixed women's fetishization when it's compared to Black women who are fully Black's fetishization, and then also mixed women who are mixed with different races, not just Black and white. Like there's a lot of layers to what we're saying a mixed woman is and how they're treated. So I want to know if that fits into your analysis at all.
No, you're absolutely right. So that's not, and thank you so much for bringing this up. So you're absolutely right, right? That I'm interested more, right, in how the US and Brazil, right, imagine mixture, right? How these media productions imagine mixture, but you are right on, right? And who gets, right, the most kind of symbolic and the most exposure, right, in terms of imagery. But you are absolutely right on, right? The way in which mixture often gets talked about, I would say in both countries, right, is of white with something else, right? And that feeds into, I would say, this fascination and this obsession with oh, Brazil and the US, oh, yeah, we know we have this non-white population, but it's okay because, and actually in the US, right, the non-white population is growing, but it's okay because they're not going to be, right, they're going to be kind of close to white. Hey, they're going to be kind of, you know, not white, but kind of almost. So it's actually a way of talking about racial anxieties. Okay? And you're absolutely right. There's not a lot of discussion at all, right, about, right, you know, Filipino, right, and Mexican American, right, or talking about, right, Black and Korean, right, that kind of erased. But the reason, right, for this book, right, that I focus more on Black-white mixture, right, is because historically, right, that's been thing in the US seen as the binary, right? You're either this or you're that, and you're absolutely right. Everything that's kind of in between or not that gets erased, right? Definitely, right? But that's been, right, such a focal point of anxiety, right? And has also been the mainstay of media productions. Okay, so for this book, right, I chose to use that, right, as the main vehicle, right, to open up these questions about racial anxieties and anti-Blackness, right? But you are right on with that, and this idea too of what mixed looks like. You are right on with that as well. Right? Something I push back on. You know, well, what does it mean to look mixed? Okay, what does it mean to open up, right? What does it mean to look Black? Right? What does it mean to look like this? Right? And really that's a privileging constantly of what we think we know. And often that's coming from mass media images, right? From what we see, right, on TV, right? Who gets the most, again, like exposure, right? In terms of what we actually are able to see within the mass media universe. But again, right, it's you're absolutely right on, right, that there's not one way, right, to look mixed. And it's also one of the reasons, right, precisely why I bristle against putting anyone who's mixed into this broad mixed or multiracial category, precisely because it completely erases and collapses all those tensions, right, and all those differences and particularities. So I thank you, right, for that clarification and bringing in that nuance.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mitchell, and thank you, Kennedy. And I'm mindful of time, so I'm just wanting again to deeply appreciate your insightful and truly eye-opening talk today, Dr. Mitchell. And with that, I'll pass it over to my colleague Ian to help conclude things today. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mitchell, and I appreciate all of the questions and this very insightful discussion that we've had, and it's been wonderful. And I've learned a lot. And we promised to 1:30, so we don't. If there are any other student questions, I don't want to have the last word, especially if there's still that question or comment from a student. That we'd love to hear that, but I know everyone is busy, as are you. I think one of the most important insights of your talk, that at least to me, is this idea that historically, in both the US and Brazil, we need to look at white supremacy, right? And that this has been over the centuries protected in many, many ways. And so what is interesting with Brazil, as you talk about, is the ways that this has been regulated. You mentioned the census. And in the beginning of your talk, you talked about the category of pardo and parda. And as you know, that's a very old category. It's almost 400 years old. And it's always held within it this idea of mixture, not only of Black, but also indigenous. And what I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is happening in Brazil is that category has grown in the census, right? More Brazilians have gravitated to marking the pardo parda box, which as you translate as brown, but could be mixed or mixed Black or even mixed indigenous, right? And more Brazilians have checked that, right? And at the same time, there's this interesting rise in the last decade or two of this category in the US of brown, right? Which is also kind of expanded. Yet the US doesn't have a very old kind of category like has existed in Brazil, similar to pardo and parda. Yet, as you point out, I think sexuality and gender is so important, right? You know, these carnival shows and these spectacles of show de mulata, right? We're very sexualized theatrical performances of mulata women. They would never be called show de parda. That's just kind of weird, right? So it in some ways, the pardo parda category has for a long time kind of stripped out that sexualization. It's almost like there's no sexuality at all to the pardo parda category. And it's interesting to think about that as a state strategy. I don't know, I mean, of course, to protect, I think, white supremacy, but I'm still unsure how. And so more of a question if this very old category of pardo parda in Brazil and this kind of new category in the US of brown, where you see the parallels, similarities, or differences. But again, I hope that there is another question from a student. We can go for a few more minutes. And again, thank you so much for this wonderful talk. And thank you to Maya for moderation and Vibhu for introducing. It's been very, very interesting, and I've learned a lot. Thank you.
I'm just gonna wait just a minute just to see if there's another question, and then I might incorporate all of them in. But these are great questions and also really difficult questions. This is I have to say, like, this is one of the more like engaged crowd that's kind of pushing back. I'm like, I love this. This is fantastic. Just seeing if there's any more just for a second. Okay, so one of the points that I wasn't able to go into as much in the talk is the last census that Brazil had, and this is very fascinating to me, actually had for the first time more Brazilians, right, identify as non-white than white, right? So more that identified as pardo, right, or as preto. And this is not because the population actually grew, it's that or chose to self-identify, right, as pardo, right, or preto, or indígena, right, or amarela, and which the same population might in the previous census had chosen to identify as white. So this is definitely part, right, of the changing in discourse and race consciousness with media changes, social activism, movements, race conscious policies, right, like affirmative action, quilombos, right, which are kind of communities that are recognized by the state or as Afro-Brazilian communities that have, you know, some degree of autonomy. So at the same time, right, that the last census, right, saw this growing shift in self-identification, we also get Bolsonaro, right? And we also got, right, a huge shift, right, political shift to the right. And that at one point had very confusing, but also makes sense, right? Because we also saw a lot of similarities in the US, right, with what we just had, right, just a few months ago, and of the rising, unfortunately, like still in both countries, the rising tide, right, of white supremacy, at the same time as there's this mobilization towards race consciousness, a mobilization, right, towards race conscious policies in the US, an actual changing demographic, right, a population that is actually physically growing, right, not just a shift in self-identification. And so what I see actually what's happening in both countries is that as there's a threat, right, to white supremacy, right, here, right, both through race consciousness, through education, through policy, through actual population shift, and as we're seeing actually more solidarities and possible coalitions, there's also this, I wouldn't even say backlash, right? I would actually say it's a antagonism in both the US and Brazil that's always been there, right? So often some of the questions, and so I'm going on a little bit of a tangent here, but I'll come back. It is, wait, I don't understand, right? So we had like Barack Obama, and then we have this white supremacy. I'm like, yeah, it's because, right, exactly, it's this perceived threat, right, to white supremacy. Right, the same that we have in Brazil, right, because of the rise in Afro-Brazilian mobilization, right, the rise in actually a shift in racial identification, we also get this pushback, right, to undo any of those gains. Right. So at the same time, I think that there's really important conversations that we have also in the US and in Brazil to learn from each other, right, so that we don't get surprised again. And to be really careful also as well to think about solidarities and coalitions, but also not to collapse these categories. Okay, so I know there's been in the U.S., right, definitely a lot of discussion, right, over the Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? Do we lump all of those, or no? Let's actually talk about how anti-Blackness is very particular, okay, but also how groups that are often non-white, can align themselves with whiteness, right? In some cases, right? Right, because it gives certain privileges, right? So let's also talk about how those dangerous, right, coalitions are also at play, and the same in Brazil. So really what I'm also more interested in, right, is how do these categories that like pardo, right, or brown, right, that might see themselves as encompassing mixture, how do they stay at heed to make sure that they're constantly reevaluating and reflecting, think about what their ties to anti-Blackness might be, and choose consciously to align themselves politically with Blackness. I'm not talking about a Rachel Dolezal here, right? I'm not like, like let's do some blackface here, right? But I'm talking about how do we politically align, right, our goals and values and policies, right, with Black political identities. And those are some of the conversations that I'm interested in, more in having between the two countries. And what I'm hoping, some of the students here, right, mentioned, right, like a Zendaya, right, of how do we actually use these public figures in cases who acknowledge, right, or like a Camila Batanga in Brazil, who acknowledge that they're given a good deal of privilege in comparison to darker skinned women, but not in comparison to white women. We're not talking about that. We're kind of like pitting them against each other. I'm like, let's talk about, right, why these white women have all these roles, right? And instead of being like, oh, how come the light skinned women get all the roles, which is true. We need to talk about that. But let's talk about how there's actually just not enough roles, right? Or let's just talk about there's not enough representation, right, in general, right, for Black women, right, or for people who are, right, non-white, and opening that up even larger, right, where there's not enough spaces politically in the media sphere, at various institutions, right, for those who have not necessarily aligned themselves with white patriarchy. That was a very long-winded answer.
It was perfect. It was perfect. I think so much to consider as we close out the talk today. So thank you again, Dr. Mitchell, for your time and your insights. And thank you to everyone who attended in the midst of your busy schedules. Deeply appreciate you making time. And we hope to be able to welcome you to Soka University in person in the near future, Dr. Mitchell. And thank you so much again, everyone.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for these really wonderful, challenging questions. It makes me more excited when this is, at different, better times to be able to actually come in person and engage and have longer, lengthier conversations. Thank you.
Absolutely. We'll hold you to that. We look forward to that time. Thank you so much, everyone.